Recently, it has come to my attention that time passes much faster than it used to. Is it just me? I suppose I credit it with getting older, and with that lived history, an increased awareness of the value of moments, as well as with now working outside the home. Even though I worked as a freelancer from home for quite a few years, before I began in this role, it had been quite a while since I had worked outside the house with the regularity and intensity that I now do. Something about leaving the house in the morning most days for many hours at a time seems to put this separation between home time and work time in ways that are really helpful, but also seem to speed things up. I like to open the windows in my office here in the church on less humid days. And when a breeze comes through, it often blows the pages of my Bible or hymnal or commentary or whatever book I have open in front of that window. And time often feels like that, blowing quickly by page, rushing ahead before I sometimes feel like I'm ready. Back in the spring, April and May, as I thought about the great expanse of the summer lying ahead and this Sabbath theme that we were considering, it seemed to make a lot of sense. This last month that is before us of official summer feels like a good time to take a breath, pause for a moment, and talk about what it means to honor the Sabbath, thinking about things like rest, slowing down, maybe taking a last vacation, before the busyness of the fall season creeps up on us. Well, my friends, it feels like it's already creeping. I noticed on my social media this past week, a week which I will say included the last day of July and the first few days of August, that some back-to-school pictures have already started showing up. I sort of feel like we should boo that, but I am a supporter of education, so I feel like we shouldn't. But Pew Research Center actually did a study on back-to-school dates a few years ago in 2019, and they found that the start times for schools were often geographically related. The earliest area of the United States to go back to school tends to be what the Census Bureau calls the East-South Central region, so Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama. Although I will say that the pictures I saw this week are primarily from Indiana, and those are some of the first that I have seen. I found an article that lists all of central Indiana school district dates, and the earliest this year was July 26th, which means those kiddos have already been back in school for a week and a half. And I happen to know, because I researched it more, but I didn't write it all in here, that there's actually a school district in Arizona that started a full week before that. Closer to our area, the Mid-Atlantic and New England regions tend to have more schools that start on the later end of August, and even after Labor Day, which many of us probably recall as the norm when we were young. So we have back to school already creeping in. You can see in your announcements and events flyer and on the church website and from our announcements this morning that we have a lot going on here in our congregation and local community. Lots of opportunities to volunteer, our table at the fair, a church picnic coming soon, some really great events planned for our prime time 50-plus group, some intriguing speakers in the coming weeks and months, the beginning of a new year of faith formation classes, lots of stuff. Our family is going on vacation this coming week, and I am looking forward to that rest, but also bracing a bit for the reality that upon our return, things will be in motion. Sports practices, vacation Bible school, college move-in, which, by the way, if anyone is interested in assisting families of new students with moving their belongings into residence halls, text me or email me. The college is open to helpers, and that could be a neat way to connect. So what do we do when we feel like we need to rest, yet we never really have a break in the calendar to do so? I would suggest that we need to make the break and keep it holy. The 10 Commandments are familiar. Even for those who have never been part of organized Christianity or Judaism, the 10 Commandments, also known as the Decalogue, are sort of a culturally known thing, if for no other reason than the annual television airing of Charlton Heston as Moses in the 1956 Ten Commandments film each spring. Others of us may have memorized this text, these commandments, perhaps as children, which I will note is a slightly different list depending on whether you are talking about Roman Catholic, Orthodox, Reformed, Lutheran, Jewish, or Protestant traditions. But even if the commandments are familiar, one might not be able to name them all. Can you? Maybe we can come up with them together. I have them here on my paper. Let's see what we can remember. 10 Commandments, go. What's that? Shall not steal. Rich? Lord is your God. So technically, the Lord is your God is a preface and sometimes combined with one or two, depending on the list. But that is, the Jewish tradition tends to consider that the first commandment. That is the first thing that is in this list. What else? Shall not kill. Honor thy father and mother, very important, I would just like to note, to this corner of the room. What else? Don't take the Lord's name in vain, or I really like the way that the CEB puts it, do not use God's name as if it were of no significance. Something about that, but that's not the sermon. Okay, keep going. Don't covet. A whole bunch of things, a whole bunch of people. Say it again. No graven images, idols, and do not worship them. Don't bear false witness or testify against thy neighbor. Listen to me. What are we missing? Do not commit adultery. The Sabbath, thank you. That was not a plant. I think we might have named them all. I meant to bring a pencil so I could cross them off, but I think we got them all. But these commandments provide some guidance to the Israelites on how to behave towards God and towards one another. It's not an exhaustive list of how we should act, how the Israelites should act, scholars would posit. Some pretty important pieces are missing, such as God's call for justice to the poor and the widow and orphan and stranger, as we talked a little bit about last week. But for the moment, for today, we're going to focus on the Sabbath commandment, which is introduced in Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day and treat it as holy. 6 days you may work and do all your tasks, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Do not do any work on it, not you, your sons or daughters, your male or female servants, your animals, or the immigrant who is living with you. Because the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and everything that is in them in 6 days, but rested on the seventh day. That is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. In this Exodus text, this is the most developed and described of all 10 commandments, more than just the simple language of do not do X. And it's actually one of only 2 that do not start with or primarily have this negative no or do not language in them, although this commandment does have it a couple of verses in, do not do any work on the Sabbath. In Hebrew, this word is Shabbat, which for many of us will evoke thoughts of the Jewish practice of observing the Sabbath from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday. Observant Jews will often attend a Shabbat service at synagogue, then return home for a meal with family. It is a time of celebration, and the focus is on 2 things: remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. This remember the Sabbath isn't a passing think about it sort of instruction. It is a do it instruction. It's also important to remember that this isn't a do it and then I will save you or take care of you sort of thing. In the scriptures, when God gives the commandment, God has already led the Israelites to freedom. They have already been saved. This is an instruction from God on how they can continue to be in covenant relationship together. This is guidance from God on how the people should respond to God's continued presence and reality in their survival and daily life. The Ten Commandments actually appear twice in Scripture, once in Exodus 20, as we've just seen, and then again in Deuteronomy 5, verses 12 through 15. Keep the Sabbath day and treat it as holy, exactly as the Lord your God commanded. 6 days you may work and do all your tasks, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Don't do any work on it, not you, your sons or daughters, your male or female servants, your oxen or donkeys or any of your animals, or the immigrant who is living among you, so that your male and female servants can rest just like you. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt, but the Lord your God brought you out of there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. That's why the Lord your God commands you to keep the Sabbath day. The Sabbath commandment is almost identical in both places. In Exodus, God gives the Israelites these commands soon after the Israelites have fled Egypt. In Deuteronomy, it is the words of Moses as he seems to retell the story much later to the Israelites, as they are standing on the edge of the promised land. We talked about that a bit when we looked at Deuteronomy and considered Moses' reality of way closing behind him, knowing that he would not go on into the promised land with the people whom he had led. Interestingly, even though both of these two appearances of the Decalogue in Exodus and Deuteronomy are almost identical, there is one piece that you might have noticed that is different: the reason given for why the Sabbath is being instituted. According to Exodus, God rested, and we also then rest as we are made in God's image. And this is a clear reference back to Genesis 2. The heavens and the earth and all who live in them were completed. On the sixth day, God completed all the work that he had done, and on the seventh day, God rested from all the work that he had done. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it, God rested from all the work of creation. But according to Deuteronomy, the why, the reason given for the Sabbath, is different. The instruction to rest is because God led Israel out of slavery in Egypt. This one seems a little disconnected. What does God leading the Israelites out of Egypt have to do with maintaining the Sabbath? Remembering the Sabbath isn't just an instruction, I'm sorry, Jason, to lie down and take a nap. Oh, we wish. I wish. Remembering the Sabbath is an exercise in remembering. Remembering, namely by resting, but in so doing, remembering specific things, remembering God as creator, but also remembering the Lord your God as Savior, specifically the one who led you, Israelites, out of Egypt. And by resting, you are reminded of the freedom you have, thanks to God, to rest and to allow your slaves to rest. But this remembering, it's not going to happen by itself. And God knew and knows that. Perhaps that's why it was commanded. It has to be intentional, planned, set apart, put in place. This time of breaking away from routine, the mundane busyness of lives, is not really our human tendency, unless we get to the point where we have to break because we are so worn down that we can't continue. A healthier option We follow God's commandment to remember the Sabbath, God's commandment to make the break. Make the effort to break the routine. Make the effort to take a break from that which we think drives us, and instead rest for a while in that which truly drives us, the essence of God's love and peace and presence. Because it is there that we are able to take the opportunity to listen, and perhaps more importantly, to hear what God would have us to hear. To heal from the friction of our lives constantly wearing away like the tread on the road of everyday life. To refresh and be ready to carry that essence of God back into the world of our everyday lives. Until such time as we need to remember the Sabbath and make the break again. To provide freedom to ourselves and others in the same way that God has provided freedom to us. And this is all part of why Christians tend to worship on Sunday mornings, driven by this desire to remember the Sabbath and collectively make the break, drawn together on this particular day by the ancient story of Jesus' resurrection and the newness of life and recreation, refreshment and transformation that emerges from the continued life of Jesus among us. We not only remember the Sabbath, but on the Sabbath, during the Sabbath, we remember this one and only true God who created this world and everything we experience, and who also led both the Israelites and all people to freedom from those systems and ideas and structures that oppress. That God, that one, remember that during this set-apart time. And the best way you can do that, O people, is by resting. Shift your focus away from the work that keeps you busy, break away from the routines of human life, and instead busy yourself singularly with touching back into the sacred inspiration for all of life and satisfaction and love and peace and sustenance and wholeness. The work of this Sabbath day is only to do that. In other words, keep it holy. Holy. Sacred. Consecrated to God. Set apart from the world as we see and understand it. Encompassed by mystery, and for the purpose of connecting humans with the divine mystery, that which inspires awe and reverence. So how do we rest in ways that keep it holy? The instruction is to keep the Sabbath holy by resting, but this isn't necessarily the kick back and relax type of rest for the indulgence solely of one's own desires or to-do list, a selfish twist. Keeping it holy implies that this Sabbath is set apart as a sacred time, different from worldly or profane, non-sacred time. Reminded by the special time that is set apart as the Sabbath, it becomes then an attempt to hold all time as holy. For in remembering the Sabbath day, we tend to remember the concept of Sabbath both during the designated time of Sabbath and outside of that special time as well, as we look forward to it, so that our lives do not fall into meaningless, repetitive work, but instead our lives are enhanced by remembering God as creator of all and as the one who provides salvation from that in which we are trapped or enslaved. There are 2 back-to-back stories in the Gospel of Mark relating to Jesus' treatment of the Sabbath, and we're going to look at them in more depth in a couple of weeks. But for now, I want to just look at part of the first one in Mark chapter 2, verses 23 to 24 and 27 to 28. Jesus went through the wheat fields on the Sabbath. As the disciples made their way, they were picking the heads of wheat. The Pharisees said to Jesus, "Look, why are they breaking the Sabbath law?" And Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was created for humans. Humans weren't created for the Sabbath. This is why the human one is Lord even over the Sabbath." The Sabbath was created for humans. Humans weren't created for the Sabbath. From the Message paraphrase, the Sabbath was made to serve us. We weren't made to serve the Sabbath. Jesus is the model for the Sabbath. Because of our understanding of Jesus as the incarnation, the human reality of God in the world, we view the Sabbath through a Christocentric, Christ-focused lens. Jesus here in Mark asserts his authority, his jurisdiction over this familiar basic Sabbath commandment. The Jesus way is now in play. The Sabbath was created for people, to care for people. Jesus clarifies that it is not intended to be an obligatory, critical, black or white, regulation-based system. I want to caution that this is not an anti-Jewish sentiment of any kind. Absolutely not. And we need to be cautious about how this text sways our perception of the Pharisees and ancient Judaism. And as I said, we'll look at this text more closely and that part of it on the last Sunday of August, and we'll think about Jesus' conflict with the religious authorities and the scenarios in Mark that relate to the Sabbath that we read about. But for the moment, I just want to dwell on this idea of Sabbath through the lens of the Gospels. Jesus' words that the Sabbath was made for humans. What work have you been doing that leaves you exhausted, spent, empty? What enslaves you today? From what do you need to be saved? From what do you need to rest? What routine or habit or situation or work or concern, whether that is vocational work or emotional work or relational work or physical work, as important or not as it may be? What thing has you so completely invested that you feel like you don't have a moment to think about something else? Remember the Sabbath. Make the break. Rest from that work. Take a pause from that which has hooked you and pulled you in, and open yourself to the Spirit's presence and the nudging which might only be felt during that time of rest. And keep it holy. Dwell in the sacredness, the otherness of life and moment and all that surrounds us that is not by our own doing. We tend to become so focused on the outcomes of our own productivity that we don't rest in the holy and sacred work of God's hand in and around and with the world. God desires our wholeness, and the avenue to that is our intentional and purposeful desiring to rest in the Sacred One's holiness. We are commanded to make it so.